For those of you who don't know me, I'm Famida Kapadia. I am the founder and CEO of Amplify MedTech. I have been working with MedTech companies for nearly 2 decades now. I have supported them in from build to scale. I also help translate technologies from the university, and I've helped spin out companies. I've helped launch an institute. I've done a few little interesting things during my career. And I launched Amplify MedTech with the mission to build a unified MedTech ecosystem to really promote collaboration, networking, and sharing of resources so that the MedTech ecosystem in the region can thrive and we can create a locally sustainable ecosystem that will stimulate economic growth. So currently, what we are very active with is educational programs like the one that you are in right now. We have a couple networking events coming up this year, and we're building partnerships for like Jiva Clinical Trials is one of our partners. So we're building partnerships so that we can develop the ecosystem that startups need in order for them to continue building and growing. We are also working on resource mapping and online solutions, and those are things that will come down the line as and when we start having them available to you. We serve the entire medtech ecosystem from startups to academic institutions to corporations, entrepreneurial service organizations, economic development agencies, because I think it's important for all ecosystem partners to collaborate in order for the entire ecosystem to build and thrive. Um, we create impact by really bringing the ecosystem together to create collaborations, create a unified ecosystem so that medtech companies can come together and find the resources that they need in one place. And hopefully, through our efforts, we plan to support economic growth and promote sustainability in the region. We have a few events coming up starting July 2nd. We have a five series workshop to build your NIH, SBIR, STTR phase one proposal. So if any of you are planning to submit an NIH, either SBIR or STTR phase one proposal, please look out for this workshop. This will be a hands-on workshop. It'll be very educational. There'll be office hours that will help you work on your independent proposals as well. So this will be a great resource for anyone who is working on an NIH, SBIR, or STTR grant. On July 9th, we have an in-person event at the Maryland Innovation Center in Columbia, Maryland. And we'll have a fireside talk on fundraising. And we're very excited to have investors as well as startups as part of this talk. And then on July 17th will be our next online panel discussion on IP strategy. So I look forward to seeing all of you at our upcoming events. And as always, I'm looking forward to collaborating, supporting, working with you. So if you would like to collaborate, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So with that, I am very excited to kick off today's panel. And I will turn it over to Harsha and Michael to go ahead and introduce themselves. So whoever would like to start.
Well, I'll go ahead. Michael Hill, thank you for the invitation to be here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share whatever I can with anybody and everybody. I'll give you a quick introduction of myself. So I am trained as a scientist, PhD in biomedical engineering, and I actually then, my only job was at Medtronic. So I spent 27 years there, started as a scientist. I've held roles in science, research, product development, clinical trials, and regulatory. So all the things that you need to do to bring something to market in the medical technology space, I've been able to actually do the work in the process. I also moved up in the organization. I spent 3 years over in Europe, working with the European regulatory affairs, of course, and also Japan, Australia, Canada, and China. So I actually have had experience globally with all the different regulatory bodies and have spoken with everyone from the head of the Chinese FDA, or what used to be the Chinese FDA, and just several different people to actually try to help promote things and harmonization of some of the regulations across the globe. In the last 3 years, I was the acting chief technology officer of Medtronic, and I also had clinical affairs. So it's one of the places where I had also the science and technology, the innovation centers, but also the clinical affairs and operations group and clinical quality. So quite the large organization and a lot of fun. I retired 4 years ago, and now I actually consult. I teach at Case Western Reserve University, which is my PhD alumni school. I also work with several investor groups. I'm an investor myself. I consult with small companies, and I work with EvoNexus, which is an accelerator down in San Diego. And I live and work between San Diego, Fort Lauderdale, and Barcelona. Having lived for 30 years in Minnesota, I tell people I deserve the 65 to 85 degrees every day. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. And we're very excited to have you on the panel. Harsha?
Yeah, thank you, Femida. Good morning, everyone. Happy Juneteenth, and it's great to be here along with two superheroes, Femida and Michael. I am Harsha Rajasimha. I'm the founder and CEO of Jiva Clinical Trials. I'm usually based out of the Washington, D.C. area in the Northern Virginia region, and I'm affiliate faculty in the School of Systems Biology at George Mason University. Today, I'm dialing in from Boston, where I am at the Bio International Convention. And it's been an exciting last 4 days here. My background, I'm a PhD in computational biology, a postdoc from NIH, FDA, and consultant to big pharma and medtech companies in the last 15 years or so. Personally, I'm a dad to 2 daughters, and I'm also a rare dad. I lost a child to a rare disease in 2012 that gave me a purpose and a mission. And my personal and professional experiences converged in accidental ways, leading me to on this mission to make clinical trials and treatment options more accessible to everybody globally, as I recognized a majority of the biotech and medtech innovation is restricted to the US and European Union, with most of the world not as engaged. And so that's been my mission over the last few years. I'm excited to share my learnings, listening to various sponsors, CROs, and pretty much all the stakeholders in the clinical research ecosystem over the last 6.5 years that I've been on this journey. It's with empathy that we have approached how to address the fundamental challenges in clinical trials. Happy to be here and look forward to this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Harsha, and thank you for all the wonderful work that you are doing in this space. So to kick us off, why don't we start by setting this stage a little bit, and let's talk about an overview of when should a company be thinking about clinical studies, either for regulatory approval or for commercialization success. What are the parameters that drive the planning of a clinical study for a startup or even for a large company?
Yeah. So, but I'll make a quick comment on that. Strategically, I think, you have to start at the beginning. And I know that's a simple answer, but it really is true. And what I mean by that is clearly in the healthcare space, there is both what I call the, clinical evidence part as well as the economic evidence part. And depending on the type of classification of your device, whether it be 510K or PMA, those pathways may be slightly different, but the need for that data is important one way or the other for you to be successful in the long run. And so you can get sometimes 510K approval very quickly, but then you still need that clinical evidence data to get clinical adoption or to get appropriate reimbursement. And so getting that clinical evidence and that economic evidence, if you will, is important to start thinking about up front, because if you can collect that data efficiently and effectively from the start, then oftentimes you don't have to go back and repeat things. So that's my quick strategic perspective.
Right. And then, Michael, to add on to that, what about international markets? What if a company wants to launch both in US and Europe? Are they some things, are there special considerations that they should keep in mind with respect to the clinical studies design?
That's a very good question as well. If you're doing something that's why approaching the regulatory agencies very early is so important. I push companies to do it as early as they possibly can. Now, some regulatory people will say, wait until you've got everything planned out and you've got a good idea. And I'm like, they're your partner. I'm a firm believer in, the industry, it's a triangle: industry, academia, clinicians, and government, regulatory and reimbursement specialists. And so, that partnership should start very early. And why I say that is because there are things like heart failure studies. Heart failure, the FDA has made it very clear that the way that we treat heart failure in the US is very different than, say, the way that people treat heart failure in Europe. And so the length of hospitalization, the things like that. So they don't like to have mixed studies. Now, if you're doing a defibrillator study, they're much more open to it because it's much more of a closed loop system. It's not as much dependent on the care and the clinical way that it's being taken care of. And so if you can combine studies or a global study, especially in the MedTech space, instead of having to repeat that in every geography that you want to get regulatory approval, it can really facilitate things. But you've got to have that information up front by talking to the regulatory bodies.
Right. Harsha?
Yeah, I would say start as early as you can, possibly. And if you are a early stage startup developing a medical device for a particular patient population, you want to start thinking about way before you go out and raise capital, so you know exactly how much capital you need, when you need it, what's the roadmap, and also understanding the epidemiology of the medical condition that your device is going to address is very critical, and that needs to start very, very early. For example, I'm here at Bio and I just met someone developing option for smoking cessation, and they realized Poland as a country, it has a huge problem with smoking, and that's important to them. And so the geographic location of where you want to run the clinical trial could also be dependent on your target patient population, where the burden is huge, where the impact is likely going to be huge, and that might actually get you the incentives that you're looking for in terms of government subsidies, support, and in-kind incentives that can actually help move faster on your regulatory pathway. So I think the clinical trial may not even be needed for certain types of devices. So it's important to understand the classification of the device and what kind of trial you may need, how many patients and sample size you may need, and that will help determine how much money you got to raise as a startup. Of course, if you are in Medtronic, then that's a different consideration. You could go global all at once or whatever. But as a early stage MedTech founder, we don't have that kind of a luxury, and so we need to be extremely focused and targeted on what we want to achieve in the next immediate milestone.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
make a quick comment on that as well. Harsha made me think of something. It is important to talk to regulatory and everything up front, but it's also very important that a startup company in the medtech area especially thinks of it. You usually have a medical device and you have some user. That's either the patient, the physician, somebody who's doing a procedure, or a human, something. So Earl Bakken, who was the founder of Medtronic, he really instilled upon the engineers at Medtronic to think about it as a very holistic perspective, because you could have the best medical device, and if you poorly used it, you could harm patients. So the best stent in the world, poorly deployed, can kill someone, right? A poor stent, properly placed, can actually provide still benefit. And so, you have to have both the device and either the usability, the use, the procedure, however you want to call it. And they both need to be worked on upfront and clear. And then the second part is that as you start thinking about starting your clinical, what is the exact patient indication, patient type that you want to include in your study? You don't want it, if it's too broad, you won't meet your endpoint. If it's too narrow, then you're going to have your labeling very narrow. And so that's always a challenge, I think, in any clinical study, is to get the right clinical patient cohort. But that's extremely important. I don't know how many times in medical device technologies that either the technology is not robust enough in the physician's hands to be successful when they try to start, and so they're not successful, or they pick the wrong or a broader patient group and aren't able to actually demonstrate what they want to show.
Excellent. Yeah.
Great.
So you guys bring in very important points, right? Harsha, you're tying the clinical trials to the fundraising milestones, which is extremely important for a startup to be aware of as to how their clinical trial design is going to tie into their fundraising milestones. And then, Michael, you bring in the very important point of human factors, which a lot of people don't think about early on, and it should be a part of the consideration very early on. So, as a follow-up question to what you mentioned, Michael, who would be good partners for a medtech company who will help them design with the clinical design, right? To make sure that they're including the right patient population. Who should companies think about partnering with for this?
Yeah. It's now, again, I come from a large, big company, and I do advise a lot of small companies and thinking about things. I think that part of that is having someone with a good clinical background. I know many people who, have gone on from large organizations or CROs and are doing consulting work or something like that. And when you have to have a efficient cap table of your human resources in a company, when you've only, you're only 3 people or something, you have to be very efficient with your effort and your time. But getting someone who's knowledgeable. And so partnering with someone who really understands the clinical and regulatory space, so that they can help you design that. You also need a clinical advocate. And what I mean by that is a physician who is, helping with the society, who is actually interested in doing it. And it's not always the, president of the society, but I always say I like to work with the person who's going to be the society president in 10 years, right? So they're a driver, they really want to excel. Those are the ones that a startup company can really operate well with, because those individuals really want to move forward and are willing to really put the time and effort in. So partnering with a good clinician advocate, and then finding a clinical partner that's actually going to, and I don't mean necessarily going out to some big CRO, but finding the right knowledge base. And so there are groups that can provide that through accelerators, through different types of things like that, to make the right contacts to get the right information.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And
Harsha, I
Michael,
wanted to
yeah.
go ahead.
I was going to say Michael gave a direct answer, and I will just add an indirect answer that the founder's curiosity and the unquenching customer discovery is very critical, and that will guide what are all the pieces that they will need in their particular context, as it can vary from device to device and the specific target indications. The other part is be open to innovative new solutions, especially in this day and age. The era is demanding a lot of efficiency. And so what worked last 10, 20 years may not be the answer for your situation. So there may be newer, better, efficient ways of getting things done. And so being open and to those types of solutions could actually help you advance much faster.
Yeah, in fact, I wanted to make a comment. I agree, Harsha. You mentioned customer discovery, and I really support that. In fact, in several of the Q-Sub meetings that I've had with several of the startup companies that I'm involved with, FDA has come back and asked about patient advocacy. So did you do patient or customer clinician surveys? And did you talk to 50, or did you talk to 200, or who did you talk to, and what did you ask them, and did you write that up as a report, and what was the feedback? And the patient advocacy can really work well, and the risk benefit perspective that the FDA has when they're looking at a medical device technology.
Absolutely. And in addition, developing deep empathy for how the product is going to be used to kind of figure out the product market fit much before you even develop the product fully and validate it can really benefit in understanding how you design the product also. And so that going and visiting firsthand in person and looking at what the surgeons are doing, if you can shadow them and observe how that interaction looks like, that can give significant insights, that aha moments that can actually be critical success factors.
Absolutely. I'm loving this discussion, right? Because it's like going back to basics, making sure that you have done your customer discovery right, because that's going to be valuable even in your clinical trial designs, right? And a lot of companies, they think customer discovery is a one and done thing. You start with customer discovery, you get it done, and then you're like, okay, I'm done with my customer discovery. And it sounds like it's an ongoing process. It's not a one and done thing. You constantly have to bring your patients into the conversation, or your physicians. Norel has a question. So let's take a question.
Yeah, so in this same line of discussion, I had some questions with regards to low to middle income countries as well as decentralized clinical trials. But before I ask, let me take a step back and just describe what my company Nanost is doing. So we're a point of care device company, so MedTech. We are target agnostic because we are essentially a platform technology, and we can rapidly iterate new cartridges, which is the focus of the grants that we were mentioning, Famita and I, that we're chatting about before the meeting. One of our moats, for example, is that we're heat stable, meaning, you could bake these things at 60 degrees Celsius, everything will be fine. It's also why the military likes us quite a bit. That being said, we do plan on submitting everything to the FDA on a 510(k) path, CLIA waiver either in parallel or, slightly staggered to broaden the market access. But I don't want to be a sitting duck while our dossier is under review. So the thought process was, okay, well, let's also market this to low to middle income countries where there's little to no regulatory hurdles. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, but also decentralized clinical trials, because I think you can use this to enroll remotely patients. And correct me if I'm wrong, as long as the patient themselves is not getting the results of those tests, it's not technically a diagnostic. So a pharma company, and AstraZeneca, can use this to enroll people. And I'll pause there.
Yeah, I'd have to understand a little bit more in detail, but when you're talking about other countries, I would check and confirm regulatory, of course. I mean, so many times with medical technologies, you can get a CE mark approval, which opens the doors not only for most of the European countries, but also several other countries as well that accept that with the notified bodies. And so, if that's within your strategy, and that is actually an opportunity for you, because as a small company, one of the things that oftentimes investors are concerned about is not necessarily distraction, but taking on too many things. I mean, you need to focus. And so as long as it can actually be part of, if it's part of your strategy and it makes sense and it helps build toward your endpoint of where you want for either your first opportunity for exit, your second opportunity for exit, or whatever your plan is for your growth, for your hockey stick, growth and valuation opportunities, then it makes sense. But I would be very careful about being unfocused, if you will, from an investor standpoint, if you're trying to do too many things. Now, like I said, sometimes it's right in strategy and it's great because if you can get revenue or you can do something else or get a clinical adoption, if it makes sense, depending on what it is, it can work.
Yeah, and I guess the 2 points to that, just to be clear. So it would be the first set of targets that we develop for US and EU approval that could potentially also apply to a low to middle income country. So that I don't want two sets of, products right out of the gate. And this idea does seem to be resonating with investors that we are speaking to, because they're like, yeah, it's going to be 6 months to a year while the FDA reviews your packet. So if you can generate revenue, go do it.
Right. And with MedTech, I find that often, I just spoke with a company yesterday here at Bio that I've been consulting with for about a year, and that's their plan. I mean, they're going to, I think it is like Chile and Colombia and Australia, and they're doing their first in man. And this is actually, like an implantable product. So it actually is a little bit more longer term strategy, but, they're planning on trying to get 30 to 45 patients outside, globally. And actually we'll probably be able to get CE mark with that data. And then use that as a way to make sure they really understand which clinical trial they're going to do for the FDA.
Yeah. Oh, and you mentioned CE mark data, which reminded me, because what I've learned is that if you also do clinical trials in Australia and New Zealand, where the costs are lower, that data is also accepted by FDA.
Oftentimes it is.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Norel, for that question. Harsha, you had something to add?
Yeah. So I just want to say that what Norel brought up is a very important upfront questions and strategy that is very, very critical. And so I know, Famita, you have number of topics you like to cover, but the front loading of the regulatory and clinical strategy is so important, as you could potentially kill a number of birds with a single stone kind of a situation, where now there is a lot of regulatory innovation happening, and there is cooperation between FDA, EMA, and even the Indian regulator. I know they opened a gateway and a channel, a bridge between US FDA and Indian Drug Controller General, where all the oncology related trials could have sites in India and access patients in India and move much faster. And it is facilitated through the FDA's official channels. And so talking to the regulators directly, scheduling the Q-sub or whatever the early meetings with the regulators and getting their direct input can be quite necessary and critical in avoiding any downstream heartburns and mishaps.
Yeah, very well said. And actually, this actually brings us into another topic by itself, which was how do you stagger your studies, right? So you have your FDA approval, but as you're doing studies, you have gaps in that process when FDA is reviewing the data, especially towards the end of the trial when you submit. It takes a few months before you get the yes or no. And so how can companies think about being efficient in that time? Should they wait for the 6 to 9 months till FDA gets back to you? Or what can they do in the meantime to optimize their go-to-market strategy?
Well, of course, you can't market anything until you get FDA approval, right?
Correct.
That's just a warning thing right out there. So don't pre-sell. That can get you into a lot of trouble. On the other hand, from a large strategic organization perspective, getting ready for market launch is making sure that you're, if you've got a clinical study, if you do have a clinical study, when is it going to be published? What's your publication strategy? What's your announcement strategy, right? I mean, it would be great to have FDA approval and for some cardiac product, let's say, FDA approval and the publication come out online right at the beginning of the American Heart Association meeting or something, right? I mean, that would be ideal. And then, and have the primary investigator of the study present at American Heart Association the results. So, those are the kind of things. What's your publication strategy? What about manufacturing and distribution? So do you have all the manufacturing? When you release that day, you can actually sell product. And so do you have 5 products in inventory or do you have 250,000 products in inventory? And so that buildup oftentimes takes a little bit of time to do it because you're probably building clinical grade product levels before, and now you've got to build commercial launch product levels. And so scaling, don't ever underestimate the difficulties of scaling. So I don't know, Harsha, if you have any thoughts on that, but.
Yeah, no, 6 to 9 months is a very short period of time. So it would be a mistake to think that, oh, we have a lot of time. What do we do now? I think there is so much planning that needs to be done ahead of starting a trial, that, training materials, technical variability testing, and also planning all the educational material, usability, and those types of human factors related aspects. And also planning, right? And having multiple options, having protocols designed, maybe even 2 or 3 options, depending on what we are anticipating as feedback from the regulators before it comes, and be prepared so that we don't waste any time. Once the regulatory hurdle is cleared, we are off to the races.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about trial design then, right? Like for somebody who's never done a trial design before, this is their first time doing it, what should they be thinking about? Like how should they go about thinking about their trial design?
Yeah, so I'll just jump in quickly. One of the most important things is making sure that your endpoint is a clinically relevant endpoint. Obviously, you want to have a statistically significant endpoint, and that will drive your sample size, et cetera. But, oftentimes people may have a statistically significant difference between groups, but if it's not clinically relevant, meaning that physicians are going to look at that and say that that's a meaningful, real difference that will make a difference in patient outcomes, because not always do you have mortality benefit or something out at the end as an endpoint. Those are big, long studies. But, if you just are measuring some protein difference, what does that really mean for a patient? And so does that really mean an outcome that's going to be clinically relevant? And oftentimes, again, in the risk benefit will say, well, so what? right? You see a TNF alpha change or something, but does it make any difference in the outcome of the patient? So oftentimes that's a important determinant in the clinical trial design up front. FDA never put you into a corner. They will give you enough rope to hang yourself, if you will, but they will let you go on those kinds of things. You clearly want to hit your endpoint, but you want it to be a clinically relevant endpoint. That's one comment.
Yeah. Yeah. In addition, I would say having strategies around basket trials, umbrella trials, where you're looking at potentially covering related indications within a particular broader aspect of what you're where you have the biggest impact. It could be based on adult and pediatric as two separate arms, or having different genders, if you will. I heard someone say women have smaller hearts than men, and stuff like that. So you don't want to combine everybody in a single arm, and so that you can analyze and have statistical power at the end of the study. So I think giving due consideration to whether it's depending on whether it's cardiovascular device or something else, having a very sharp eye, keen eye, and understanding of who are the target patients. Is it a homogeneous patient target population, or is there slight variations within the target audience? I think can be very key.
Yeah, and Fatima, I want to make a comment on that as well. Right now, and regardless of your political color or leanings, science to me at least is under attack, if you will. And I would say, keeping integrity in our science and in our clinical evidence that we're trying to gather and present, to me, is still very important. Scientists and clinical professionals, we need to really make sure that we're doing the best that we can to make sure that we have the best integrity and doing the right things for the clinical evidence that we gather. And in order to do that, I do think that we need to think of, how we do the clinical studies, and also think of equipoise. So if there's already an approved product on the market, withholding that in a randomized controlled trial for control is actually unethical. And the equipoise of doing that is not appropriate, to withhold a known therapy that's been around for years or something to actually then do something else. And so understanding how to do those things, approaching those things with an ethical, integrity, and trying to make sure that we're getting the right evidence for the right things, because treating patients is very important. And also when you start a clinical trial, patients, you have a contract with a patient that you're going to do that clinical trial. Those patients accept a certain amount of risk with any kind of clinical study. And you have, as a company or a funder, a commitment to follow that through for that patient because of the commitment that they've made on their side. And it's a disappointment to me that many clinical trials have just been stopped in the middle and just left patients hanging. And to me, that is a damage to the integrity of clinical trials and clinical evidence. So I'm sorry I don't want to offend anyone, but I just want to make the point that, we've got to stick together and really push hard for science and clinical evidence.
I will add that blinding and whether it's a single blind, double blind clinical trial design is a very critical consideration, particularly in medical device, as blinding can actually be impossible in certain types of medical devices. So that would be a very critical consideration as well.
Very, very important points. And so I would like to bring on another important point, which you guys kind of touched on, but I would love for you to elaborate on it, is the diversity in patient recruitment for your clinical trials. How do you ensure that you're getting a diverse patient population?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When I was running some clinical trials for the implantable cardioverter defibrillator at Medtronic, we were very happy because one of the trials that I was running actually had the highest percentage of female enrollments of any ICD or device trial up to that point, and we had only 30% women enrolled. It was a large trial also. And it's one of those things where I think we really need to make sure that we have all the efforts that we can. I mean, women have defibrillators and men have defibrillators about the same rate. Maybe it's slightly different times of their life, decades of their life, but they still have the same numbers. And so, we treat patients, and if we do these randomized clinical trials and they don't actually have the patients in which the real world treats them, then that also is a problem with our studies. And so we want good results, but we have to enroll the right patients, whether that be, African Americans or Indian with like diabetes problems and things like that. Or, there's certain groups that we need to make sure that we have in a good enrollment so that we can actually be representative of the patients that we treat. And I think that's a big thing. I think we need to make sure that we provide also evidence. I mean, one of the things that I was interested in is why is that? And we've spoken with both the head of the research of FDA at the time, as well as some other people over in Europe, because we were trying very hard to make efforts to do that. And there is a difference. I'd be curious to hear what other people think about it actually, because men oftentimes will go to the physician with their spouse, and their spouse will get them to enroll in a clinical trial, where women, if they go by themselves, they will actually decline more often than not to be enrolled in a clinical trial. And so it tends to be partly cultural, at least in the United States. And so it's a very interesting phenomenon of, they feel like that they need to care for the family. And so they're the caregiver. And so they won't enroll in something of risk. So they're more risk averse. And yet they want something good for either their children or their spouse. And so there's a whole interesting psychological, cultural impact on that. But if we can find better ways to enroll, people of color, people of, the backgrounds that actually, like Native Americans, that may be important in certain studies, we need to make sure that we're enrolling the right patients in our clinical trials.
Thank you, Michael. I think he hit a lot of important points, but I will say it's such a fundamental and critical factor in understanding the target patient population, and that begins way before you register a company. If you are even thinking about a particular addressing an unmet need, like mammogram, how painful is that process? And if you think of pap smear, certain cultures, they are not, there's going to be very poor compliance with annual pap smears because they just don't feel comfortable with that procedure, right? And so what that challenges the founders and innovators is, how should the device be if we have to design it the right way so that we can cover all the target population? And it's not just the gender diversity, it's also the socioeconomic factors, it's the age. Will it help pediatric and elderly and adults? It's also various other factors like rural areas, geographic diversity, and even other countries globally. And so having that deep understanding of the target audience that we are trying to help with this new innovation is so critical, and it's not an afterthought that we after getting the FDA filings and getting the approval to start a trial, that's not when is the wrong time to think about how do we run a diverse and inclusive clinical trial. It begins way before we even start the process of designing the product itself.
Very well said, Harsha. Diversity and patient recruitment is not an afterthought. It has to be at the forefront of your even your product design, or what market you're trying to serve. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and get into the nitty-gritty of operations. What do companies have to be aware of from a management perspective, documentation perspective, compliance perspective? How should they prepare for making sure that they're gathering all the data appropriately in the right fashion, so that when they're ready to go to the FDA, then they are compliant and they're not wasting time in documentation management?
So I'll start from a strategic standpoint, and this is where Harsha can really step in and provide some good insights. I do think that it's important that up front that you have a good balance with your development team, that you're starting, especially for a small company, you need to make sure that what you start your clinical with is what you carry through your clinical with, whatever that product is. Even in a large organization, sometimes there are changes that happen along the way that create problems in the clinical because they change something in development, and that's another resubmission to regulatory. And so, making sure that there's a good balance, that it's ready to go for a clinical when it's really ready to go. And I know that sounds kind of simple, but that oftentimes creates a lot of problems because they start and then they make changes after the first 2 or 3 patients, and that creates problems in the clinical study design and the analysis and everything downstream. So making sure that you really work with your development and product development partners to make sure that you're starting at the right time. Operationally, I'm a scientist. I like to collect a lot of data. I think that you need to collect the right data and not just over collect or under collect. That's also wisdom. It's experience, and making sure that you're getting the right data that you can get the understanding of what you want for the clinical trial. And Harsha can speak to some of that. I think that you want to make sure that you have the highest quality. PMDA, some of the regulatory bodies, if you have any problem with your data, especially in Japan, they are very critical about accepting. If you find informed consent problems, some of the simple things, they will literally just throw out your entire study. So you have to make sure that it's really done with the highest quality and integrity that you can.
Yeah, great points, Michael. And I would say, think about all the different types of data that you're needing to collect as part of the protocol, the design of the case report forms, and the size of the imaging data that might come out of these devices sometimes can be quite large. And you want to be, having a streamlined process to avoid as much of fragmentation and silos of these data sitting in different tools, different clouds, different storage devices, and collating all this data as an afterthought is going to be slow, expensive, and sometimes impractical. And you may have to even question the integrity of the data at the end if it is not thought out properly right from the beginning. And so having a great data partner and a strategist that can help you think through the integrity of the data, the unification and streamlining of the data process, that also fits with the human factors aspects, operational aspects, as there is complexity around you as a sponsor, there is sites or investigator teams and coordinators, there is clinical research associates if it's a large study requiring a CRO to monitor this, and investigators who have to review and sign off on the documents and data that the coordinators may have entered. And so having a real-time view of this as the study progresses in a de-identified way is so critical, and ensuring that you're monitoring on an ongoing basis in a way that you can take corrective action, preventive action before it's too late. And that means you got to keep shining light in corners before problems emerge downstream. And that's the most critical part. And the answer is not throwing a lot of money at a large CRO as the only solution. There are better, efficient ways of achieving the same goals with better tools, modern technologies that are available. But it does take a lot of planning, strategic thinking, and identifying the right partners who can guide you through that process if you haven't been part of the clinical trial execution in your professional experience, which is not surprising for founders of startups.
Right. Very well said. So, Harsha, as a follow-up, what are some of the common pitfalls or hurdles that you have seen startups make when it comes to, the clinical studies? And what advice do you have? How can they avoid those, or how can they try and minimize those?
Yeah, so one of the things is assuming that they need to raise a lot of money or more money than they need to really achieve a milestone, or less money than they need to achieve the milestone, just because they haven't spent enough time having a sound strategy on exactly what's the specific baby step they need to take to achieve the next milestone, so they can get more money and achieve the next milestone. And that's number one. And two, approaching a CRO or a clinical trial management technology company too late in the process. We are 6 months away from filing an IND, we'll get back to you later, is often what I hear. But here I am as a resource, and companies like us are happy to share information, have a conversation, give you a free assessment of what you need, what you may need, and what to watch out for, what to ask the FDA, and other blind spots that you may be missing. And so continuously listening and engaging conversations, maybe you can set aside a Fridays afternoons for having these vendor debriefs. So and other partners, right? So who can actually shed very critical insights that you may be overlooking, or some surprise elements that you unexpected. So those happen all the time. So I would say those are some important aspects. And also, we all these companies have been running clinical trials forever. And so assuming that because we ran this way 10 years ago, that's the only way to run it, and that's the safest way to run it, is another myth, or say a mistake that founders make. There are newer, better ways of doing it. There's regulatory innovation as well as technology innovation and operational efficiencies, cost efficiencies, time efficiencies, especially in this era of AI and agentic AI. There are responsible ways in which you could actually use AI in meaningful ways now than we could even 2 years ago. And so paying attention to those can be precious, which I see founders often either reject without even considering, or may not even explore, just because we have done the same way 20 years.
Yeah, Harsha, I'll make a quick comment on that as well. And I completely agree. Coming from a large strategic, where we had literally 800 to 1,000 people in our clinical operations globally. So we probably had the largest CRO for MedTech in the business at Medtronic. We did a lot of it ourselves. We did it our way. We put software on top of software on top of software to be able to do the things that we wanted to do. And one of the luxuries of being a startup company is not only are you coming up with something novel to bring to market, but you aren't bound by that infrastructure that actually keeps you in doing it the same way over and over and over and over again. So you can actually use a different way to get there on both the regulatory pathway, the software, the clinical trial pathway, maybe even a new clinical trial design, Bayesian, something else, right? And so you're not bound as much by the infrastructure. Now, yes, people will want to use the tried and true, but it does open lots of opportunities. And if you are a startup company, yes, you're trying to burn down risk at every step of the way. But if you can do that and do that in a cost-efficient and effective way, that can be pretty important. So I'm going to ask Harsha a question because I've worked a little bit with Harsha, and I do think it's important for startup companies that are so cost effective and trying to be so cost conscious when they're doing clinical trials. One of the things that Jiva, with what he's doing, is trying to cut down those silos and make it much more streamlined, much more efficient, so that fewer people can actually perform a first-in-man study or a larger study. And so for startup companies especially, doing something like that where you might have one clinical person and then be able to do the entire clinical study from front end to back end, if you actually have a knowledgeable clinical trial person, that's actually really revolutionizing, I think, the way that it provides opportunities for small businesses to start moving forward, especially in the medtech space. So maybe, Harsha, you can explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael, for teeing that up. When we work with a sponsor, say in a dermatology space, like we are with a startup that's innovating with microbiome-based skincare products, for example, running a 2-week, 3-week study every month for a whole year, anticipating 10 trials in a year. Reached out to us through the website. We set up their clinical trial protocol. They already had a protocol for the first trial, and they have been designing protocols for second, third, and fourth trials as we speak. And so as we set up within the first week or two, get them up and running, train them, and they are off to the races, able to recruit patients through our platform from social media. In this case, as it was healthy volunteers that they were looking for participating in their study, and recruiting 100 subjects in 2 weeks, literally, through the online channels and email, text messaging, and getting completing that entire trial in 2 weeks, and then planning the next study. And so that's enterprise license. So they are able to log into a single place from either a mobile device or a laptop and look at all the silos, right? Which are typically silos, which is now unified in a unified platform that we provide. So we solved 2 problems in this scenario, right? They don't need to license or select 5, 10 different point solutions and fragmented tools to manage this process. It's all unified and streamlined in one login, one integrated system that's user-friendly to begin with. The second is it automates a lot of the manual, tedious jobs. So they are only a team of 2 scientists in the team and able to run a 100-patient study every month. So, and now after seeing how easy the process was, now they are dreaming up even more. And in October, they are planning a 1,000-subject study. And so we love collaborating and helping our early stage sponsors to dream big, and even increase their ambition of how fast they can execute and how big they can go with their sample sizes as well. And the complexity of the study, in getting omni-channel patient communications, sending reminders. Patients with good intentions may still deviate from complying with protocol just because they forget. And so the technology can simply sending a text message at the right time, asking the question, did you do this? Did you take that? Etc. Just a push of a button, you get the data you need about compliance and quality, while the patient gets to adhere and stay on target with their protocol. So those are some of the ways in which technologies are helping streamline, automate for better quality and better efficiency.
Right. Excellent. So you're very right? Like, we're living in the era of technology. We have so much at our fingertips in using technology to streamline processes so that we can get products to market faster, hopefully cheaper, right? With better patient recruitment, better patient enrollment. Technology can really serve the healthcare space in helping us actually serve the patients that we want to serve. So this has been such a powerful conversation. I know I have a lot of other questions for you, but I also want to be very mindful of time. So we have 3 minutes remaining. And so I would like to open up to questions.